At first, it does not feel like a mystery at all. It feels ordinary, almost invisible, woven quietly into the fabric of everyday life. A car engine hums in the distance, plastic containers rest on a kitchen shelf, synthetic fibers brush against skin without a second thought. None of these moments call for attention, yet all of them share something in common. That shared element moves quietly beneath everything, hidden in plain sight, shaping the modern world without ever introducing itself. It flows through pipelines, sits beneath roads, forms the base of countless materials, and fuels systems that never seem to stop. Its presence is constant, yet its story remains strangely distant. We rarely pause to consider it. The tank is filled, the device is used, the object is discarded, and the cycle continues without interruption. There is no moment where the origin of it all demands attention. It simply exists, reliable and familiar, as though it has always been here and always will be. And yet, beneath that sense of certainty, something begins to shift when the question is allowed to surface. Not a complex question, not one that requires deep knowledge, but something far simpler. Where does it come from? The question seems harmless at first, almost too obvious to matter, but it does not settle easily once it appears. Most people have heard the explanation. It is repeated in classrooms, in documentaries, in quiet conversations that never linger long enough to invite doubt. Oil, we are told, is the result of ancient life, buried and transformed over vast stretches of time. It is presented as a finished story, complete and resolved. But there is something about that explanation that feels distant from the way oil actually appears in our lives. The connection between ancient oceans and a modern engine is rarely felt. The time involved is so immense that it becomes abstract, almost unreal, something that exists beyond ordinary understanding. And so the question returns, not as a challenge, but as a quiet presence that refuses to disappear. If something is so essential, so deeply integrated into every part of modern life, should its origin not feel clearer, more immediate, more certain? Instead, it remains distant, described in ways that are accepted rather than truly examined. This is where familiarity begins to soften. The ordinary edges of daily life blur slightly, revealing something just beneath the surface. The fuel in the car, the material in the object, the unseen processes that support entire systems, all begin to feel less certain, as though they are part of a story that has not been fully told. It is not that the accepted explanation is dismissed. It remains steady and present, offering a sense of structure. But alongside it, a subtle uncertainty begins to grow. Not loud, not disruptive, but persistent. A feeling that something may be missing, something not fully explored, something that has been simplified for the sake of clarity. And as that feeling settles, another possibility begins to take shape. Quiet, but unmistakable. What if the story we have accepted is only part of a much larger process? What if the substance that powers the modern world carries an origin that extends beyond what we have been told, shaped by forces we have not yet fully understood? The thought does not demand an answer. It lingers instead, moving quietly through the mind, reshaping what once felt obvious. The familiar becomes uncertain, and the uncertain becomes strangely compelling. And in that quiet shift, the story begins to open, not with a conclusion, but with a deeper question, waiting just beneath the surface, guiding everything that follows into a place where certainty no longer feels complete. From here, the search does not end. It deepens, drawing the mind toward explanations that seem clear at first glance, yet begin to reveal subtle fractures when looked at closely, inviting a look. The explanation begins far away from the present, in a world that no longer exists in any familiar form. Long before cities, before machines, before anything that resembles modern life, there were oceans filled with microscopic organisms drifting quietly beneath the surface. They lived without awareness, multiplied without intention, and eventually disappeared, settling slowly into the depths below. Over time, layer upon layer of sediment covered them. Sand, silt, and minerals pressed down, sealing what remained of those ancient forms beneath the weight of the earth itself. The process was not sudden. It unfolded over millions of years, guided by pressure, heat, and the steady movement of the planet. As the story is told, something remarkable happened in that darkness. The buried remains transformed. What once existed as living matter became something else entirely, hydrocarbons, trapped within rock, waiting to be discovered. Oil, in this version of the story, is the final stage of a long and quiet transformation, shaped by time and hidden beneath the surface. It is a narrative that feels complete. It explains how life becomes fuel, how the distant past connects to the present, how something invisible becomes essential. It carries a sense of order, as though every step follows naturally from the one before it. And for a long time, this explanation has been enough. It appears in textbooks, in diagrams, in carefully constructed models that show layers of the Earth like pages in a book. Each layer tells part of the story, each step reinforcing the idea that oil is simply the result of ancient life, preserved and transformed over unimaginable time. But as clear as it seems, there is a quiet distance within it. The images are often simplified, the processes condensed into something that can be understood at a glance. Oceans become illustrations, organisms become symbols, time becomes something that can be measured in neat intervals. The deeper complexity fades into the background, and it is within that quiet simplification that questions begin to form. They do not arrive all at once. They emerge slowly, almost unnoticed at first. If oil is formed from ancient life, why do some deposits appear in places where there was little or no biological activity? If the process requires specific conditions, why do certain discoveries seem to exist outside those conditions? These are not loud contradictions. They do not immediately disrupt the story. Instead, they linger at the edges, small details that do not quite align, fragments that resist being fully explained. The accepted explanation does not collapse under these questions. It remains strong, supported by evidence, reinforced by decades of study. But it begins to feel less complete, as though it is one perspective among others rather than the final answer. There is also the matter of scale. The sheer volume of oil found beneath the Earth raises a quiet sense of curiosity. The idea that vast reserves could form entirely from biological material begins to feel more complex the longer it is considered. Not impossible, but perhaps not as simple as it first appears. And so the story remains. But it shifts slightly in tone. It is no longer just an explanation. It becomes a framework, a way of understanding that works in many cases, but leaves certain spaces unfilled. Those spaces are not always acknowledged, but they are there, waiting quietly beneath the surface. The most interesting part is not what the story explains, but what it does not fully resolve. There is a subtle tension between what is known and what is assumed, between what has been observed and what has been interpreted. The difference is small, but it matters. It creates room for something else to exist alongside the familiar explanation. Not necessarily in opposition, but in addition. And as that possibility begins to take shape, the story becomes less certain, less final. It opens, just slightly, allowing new questions to move through it. Questions that do not reject what is known, but ask whether it is enough. The answer is not given here. It is not forced or revealed all at once. Instead, it remains just out of reach, drawing the mind forward, encouraging a closer look at the parts of the story that feel less defined. Because it is often in those undefined spaces that something unexpected begins to appear. And as those spaces grow more visible, the narrative begins to shift again, moving beyond what has been accepted and toward what does not quite fit, where the edges of understanding begin to blur, and the story quietly prepares to reveal its first real inconsistency. At first, the inconsistencies are easy to overlook. They do not arrive as clear contradictions or dramatic discoveries that demand immediate attention. Instead, they appear quietly, scattered across different places, separated by distance and time, each one small enough to be explained away on its own. An oil field is discovered deeper than expected, far beneath the layers where ancient organic material is believed to have settled. Another appears in rock formations that do not match the conditions described in the familiar story. These moments are recorded, studied, and often set aside, not because they are unimportant, but because they do not fit neatly into what is already understood. Individually, they do not seem to challenge the larger explanation. Science allows for variation, for exceptions that can be adjusted within the existing framework. But when these observations begin to accumulate, something subtle begins to shift. The pattern becomes harder to ignore. There are places where oil is found in quantities that feel disproportionate to the amount of biological material that could have existed there. regions where the geological history does not fully support the conditions required for the standard process. Locations where the depth alone raises quiet questions about how such formations could have occurred. None of this is presented as proof of something else. The tone remains careful, measured, almost hesitant. The goal is not to replace one story with another, but to notice where the current one begins to stretch. And in that stretching, a sense of uncertainty emerges. It is not loud or disruptive. It does not declare that everything is wrong. Instead, it invites a different kind of attention, one that lingers a little longer on details that were once passed over. A recognition that the story, while strong, may not be complete in every place it touches. Some of these observations have been known for years, even decades. They exist within research papers, field reports, and discussions that rarely move beyond specialized circles. They are not hidden, but they are not widely emphasized either. They remain in the background, quietly waiting. And then, almost as a whisper beneath the surface of accepted knowledge, another idea begins to appear. It does not arrive as a replacement or a contradiction, but as a possibility, a suggestion that oil may not come from a single origin alone. That under certain conditions, hydrocarbons might form in ways that do not depend on the remains of living organisms. This idea is not new. It has been considered, explored, and debated over time, but it has never fully replaced the dominant explanation. Instead, it exists alongside it, acknowledged in some places, questioned in others, and often left unresolved. What makes it compelling is not that it overturns what is known, but that it offers a way to think about the inconsistencies without forcing them to fit into a single narrative. It allows the unexplained to remain open, rather than closed too quickly. And once that possibility is introduced, even quietly, it becomes difficult to ignore. The discoveries that once felt like exceptions begin to take on a different meaning. The depth of certain deposits, the unexpected locations, the scale of some reserves, all start to feel connected, not necessarily in a clear or defined way, but in a way that suggests there may be more to the story than has been fully explored. The familiar explanation does not disappear. It remains present, supported by evidence and understanding, but it is no longer alone. It shares space with something less defined, something still forming, something that invites further attention. The mind begins to move differently at this point. It no longer seeks a single answer, but begins to consider multiple possibilities, layered together, interacting in ways that are not yet fully understood. And in that quiet shift, the story deepens. The question is no longer just where oil comes from, but how many ways it might be formed, and what processes may still be unfolding beneath the surface, unseen and ongoing. There is no conclusion here, only a widening sense of curiosity. Because once something no longer fits perfectly, it creates an opening. And it is through that opening that the story begins to move further back, beyond the limits of what has been observed, into a time when the Earth itself was still forming, where the origins of everything may begin to take shape in ways that feel both distant and unexpectedly relevant. It begins with a question so simple, it almost feels unnecessary. Where does oil really come from? At first, the answer seems immediate, already known, resting comfortably within explanations that have been repeated often enough to feel complete. The idea settles easily into place, requiring little effort, offering a sense of certainty that allows the mind to move on without hesitation. But when the question is allowed to remain, when it is not answered too quickly, something begins to change. The simplicity starts to fade. Details emerge. Layers that were once overlooked begin to take shape. The explanation that once felt solid reveals its edges, its assumptions, its reliance on interpretation rather than direct observation. What seemed clear becomes more intricate, not because it was incorrect, but because it was incomplete. This is where the discomfort begins. Not as something sudden or dramatic, but as a quiet shift in awareness. The realization that what is accepted as certain may be built upon foundations that are not as fixed as they appear. That knowledge, even when supported by evidence, is shaped by the limits of what can be observed and understood at a given time. The question, once simple, becomes heavier. It no longer asks only for an origin. It begins to ask how that origin is known, how conclusions are formed, how evidence is interpreted. It moves beyond the substance itself and into the process of understanding. Oil becomes a point of focus, but the pattern extends further. The same structure exists in many areas of knowledge. Observations are gathered, models are built, explanations are formed. These explanations are tested, refined, and eventually accepted, not as final truths, but as the best representations available at that moment. Over time, they become familiar. Familiarity brings comfort. It creates the sense that the question has been resolved, that there is no need to look further. But beneath that comfort, the original uncertainty remains, not fully removed, only shaped into a form that feels stable. When the question is revisited, when it is examined without the weight of assumption, that uncertainty begins to surface again. The story of oil reflects this process. It shows how an explanation can grow from evidence, become widely accepted, and yet still leave space for alternative possibilities. It reveals that understanding is not a fixed state, but a continuous process, one that evolves as new information becomes available. This realization does not weaken knowledge. It deepens it. It allows for the recognition that certainty is often provisional, that it exists within a framework that can expand or shift over time. It encourages a different way of thinking, one that remains open rather than closed, one that values questions as much as answers. The discomfort, then, is not something to be avoided. It is part of the process. It signals that the question is still active, that it has not been fully resolved, that there is more to explore. It invites attention rather than dismissal, curiosity rather than conclusion. And as this awareness settles, the question itself transforms. It is no longer just about oil. It becomes a reflection of how knowledge is constructed, how understanding is shaped, how certainty is formed and reformed over time. It reveals a pattern that extends beyond a single subject, touching on the nature of inquiry itself. The closer the question is examined, the more complex it becomes. Not because it is unsolvable, but because it is connected to systems that are layered, dynamic, and not easily reduced to a single explanation. The search for a clear answer gives way to a deeper exploration, one that values the process as much as the outcome. And within that exploration, another realization begins to emerge. That answers are not static. They change, evolve, and adapt as understanding grows. What is accepted today may be refined tomorrow, expanded into something that includes what was once overlooked. The story, then, continues. Not as a fixed narrative, but as a progression, shaped by questions that remain open, guiding the search forward into a space where understanding is always in motion, and where each answer becomes part of a larger, unfolding pattern. What feels certain rarely begins that way. Understanding often starts as a question, shaped by observation, guided by patterns that appear consistent enough to form an explanation. Over time, that explanation is tested, repeated, refined, and eventually accepted. It becomes something stable, something that can be relied upon, something that feels complete. But beneath that stability, change is always present. New observations emerge. New tools reveal details that were previously hidden. What once seemed sufficient begins to show its limits, not as a failure, but as an invitation to expand. The explanation does not collapse, it evolves. This process is not unusual. It is the way understanding moves forward. Ideas that were once considered complete are often revisited, adjusted, sometimes redefined. The shift is rarely sudden. It unfolds gradually, shaped by evidence that accumulates over time. What was once a clear answer becomes part of a larger framework, one that includes more detail, more complexity, more connection. Oil fits naturally within this pattern. The explanation of its origin, built on the transformation of ancient life, provided a strong foundation. It aligned with observations, offered a coherent structure, and guided exploration in ways that proved effective. It became a point of certainty, a place where the question seemed to have been resolved. And yet, as new evidence appeared, that certainty began to shift. Not disappearing, but expanding. Alternative possibilities emerged. Observations that did not fully align with the original model, experiments that suggested additional pathways. The understanding did not break apart, it opened. This is the nature of changing truths. They do not move from false to true in a simple progression. They move from partial to more complete, from limited to expanded. Each stage carries value, each contributes to what follows, but none represent a final endpoint. The idea of a fixed truth begins to soften. Instead, understanding is seen as something that approaches truth, guided by evidence, shaped by interpretation, but never fully arriving. There is always another layer, another perspective, another question waiting to be explored. This does not create instability. It creates continuity. Knowledge becomes a process rather than a destination, something that moves forward without requiring absolute completion. It allows for revision without contradiction, for expansion without rejection of what came before. Within this process, uncertainty takes on a different role. It is no longer something to be eliminated as quickly as possible. It becomes part of the structure itself, a space where new ideas can form, where questions can remain open long enough to lead to deeper understanding. Uncertainty is not the absence of knowledge. It is the beginning of it. It marks the point where observation has reached its limit and interpretation begins. It signals that there is more to discover, more to refine, more to understand. Without it, the process would stop, fixed in place, unable to move forward. The story of oil reflects this clearly. It is not a problem waiting for a final solution. It is an example of how understanding develops, how explanations grow and adapt as new information becomes available. The presence of multiple perspectives, of overlapping models, of unanswered questions, does not weaken the story. It strengthens it. It shows that the system being studied is complex, that it cannot be reduced to a single explanation without losing important detail. It reveals that discovery is not about finding a final answer, but about moving closer to a more complete understanding over time. This perspective changes how the unknown is viewed. What remains unresolved is not something to be avoided. It is something to be engaged with, something that carries the potential for new insight. It invites curiosity rather than closure, exploration rather than certainty. And as this idea begins to settle, the focus shifts once again. Because even as understanding evolves, there are still areas that remain beyond its reach. Questions that have not yet been answered, processes that have not yet been fully observed, patterns that have not yet been fully explained. These unknowns are not separate from the story. They are part of it. They define its boundaries, shape its direction, and ensure that it continues to move forward, guided by the same curiosity that has carried it from the beginning. There is a point in every search where the answers begin to thin out. Not because there is nothing left to find, but because what remains cannot yet be fully reached. The path becomes less defined, the signals less clear, and the understanding that once felt solid begins to open into something wider. This is where the unknown begins. It does not appear as an empty space. It is not a void where nothing exists. It is filled with processes that continue to unfold, patterns that have not yet been fully recognized, connections that have not yet been clearly drawn. It is active, present, but just beyond the edge of what can currently be understood. The origin of oil rests partly within this space. Much has been learned. The role of ancient life, the influence of pressure and heat, the possibility of deeper geological processes, the presence of hydrocarbons beyond the Earth, all of these pieces contribute to a growing picture. They offer insight, direction, and structure, but they do not complete the story. There are still questions that remain open. How much of oil's formation is tied to biological processes, and how much may occur independently? To what extent do deep Earth systems contribute to what is found at the surface? How do these processes interact over time, and how do they vary across different regions? These questions do not have simple answers. They extend into areas that are difficult to observe, shaped by conditions that cannot be fully replicated, influenced by timescales that exceed direct measurement. They require interpretation, inference, and a willingness to accept that some aspects may remain uncertain for now. This is not a limitation in the sense of failure. It is a reflection of the scale of the system being explored. The Earth is vast, its processes complex, its history layered across immense stretches of time. The tools used to study it continue to improve. The methods become more refined. But there are still boundaries that define how far understanding can reach. Within those boundaries, knowledge grows. Beyond them, the unknown remains. And it is within that unknown that possibility exists. Not as speculation without basis, but as a space where new discoveries can emerge, where patterns that are not yet visible can begin to take shape. where explanations that are not yet fully formed can develop as new evidence becomes available. The presence of the unknown does not close the story. It keeps it open. It ensures that the search continues, that questions remain active, that curiosity does not settle into finality. It allows for the possibility that what is understood today may be expanded tomorrow, that new perspectives may reshape what is currently accepted. This creates a different kind of confidence, not one based on certainty, but on continuity. The understanding that discovery is ongoing, that knowledge evolves, that the process does not depend on reaching a final answer in order to move forward. The unknown becomes part of that process, not something to be avoided, but something to be engaged with. The story of oil reflects this clearly. It is not a completed narrative with a defined beginning and end. It is a developing understanding, shaped by evidence, influenced by interpretation, open to revision as new information appears. And within that openness, there is a quiet reassurance that there is still more to find, that the deeper layers of the earth, the interactions that occur beyond direct observation, the connections that extend across time and space, all continue to hold answers that have not yet been revealed. The unknown is not empty. It is full of processes that continue to unfold, full of patterns waiting to be recognized, full of possibilities that extend beyond what is currently understood. And as this realization begins to settle, the story moves toward its final stage. Not to close what has been opened, but to bring together what has been explored, to reflect on how each part connects, and to consider what it means to understand something that is still in motion, still evolving, still revealing itself over time. It is easy to imagine the Earth as something solid and still, a foundation beneath everything else, quiet and unmoving. From the surface, it appears stable, holding continents in place, supporting oceans, carrying life without any visible effort. But this impression is only a surface illusion, shaped by the limited way it is experienced. Beneath that surface, the planet is anything but still. The ground that feels firm is part of a structure that is constantly shifting, though the movement is slow enough to escape immediate notice. Massive sections of the Earth's outer layer move gradually, pressing against one another, pulling apart, or sliding past in ways that reshape the surface over time. These movements are not random. They are driven by forces that originate far deeper, where heat rises and circulates through the planet's interior. This circulation, known as mantle movement, does not happen in bursts or isolated events. It continues without pause, carrying energy upward, redistributing material, and influencing everything above it. The surface responds in subtle ways. Mountains form, oceans open and close, land shifts position over vast stretches of time. But these visible changes are only the outer expression of something much deeper. Within the Earth, pressure builds steadily. Heat is generated not only from the planet's formation, but from ongoing processes that continue to release energy from within. These forces interact constantly, shaping the environment in ways that are both continuous and interconnected. Nothing inside the Earth remains untouched by this movement. Elements that exist within its layers are not fixed in place. They are subjected to conditions that alter their structure, encouraging reactions that would not occur near the surface. Carbon, hydrogen, and other components move through these environments, influenced by pressure and temperature in ways that are difficult to observe directly. The idea that the Earth is active is not new. It is well understood that the planet changes, that it evolves, that it responds to internal and external forces. But what is often overlooked is the extent to which this activity continues at every moment, shaping outcomes that may not become visible for millions of years. It is within this continuous activity that a different way of thinking begins to emerge. If the Earth is constantly generating heat, constantly creating pressure, constantly allowing elements to interact under extreme conditions, then it is not simply a container holding the results of past processes. It is a system that continues to produce, to transform, to evolve. This shifts the perspective on substances like oil. Instead of viewing them solely as remnants of a distant past, preserved beneath layers of rock, they can be seen as part of an ongoing cycle. A cycle that involves not just the surface history of life, but the deeper, slower processes that operate within the planet itself. This does not mean that everything is being created anew in a way that replaces what came before. It suggests something more complex. That what exists today may be influenced by both past and present processes, layered together in ways that are not always easy to separate. The Earth, in this view, behaves less like a static object and more like a system that continues to shape itself from within. Its movements are slow, its changes gradual, but they do not stop. They carry on beneath every landscape, beneath every ocean, beneath every place where the surface appears calm. And within that constant motion, conditions exist that are capable of producing outcomes that extend far beyond what is immediately visible. The possibility begins to take form, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet shift in understanding. That the substances we find at the surface may not only be the result of what once was, but also of what continues to happen. That the Earth may not simply store oil, but contribute to its existence in ways that are still being explored. And once that idea settles, the focus naturally moves deeper, toward the environments where these forces reach their greatest intensity, where pressure and heat combine in ways that push the boundaries of what is possible, and where the processes shaping the planet reveal themselves in their most extreme form. Far below the surface, beyond the reach of any direct observation, the Earth enters a realm that feels distant from everything familiar. It is not a place defined by landscapes or boundaries, but by conditions that reshape matter itself. Heat rises steadily, not in sudden bursts, but as a constant presence that grows more intense with depth. Pressure builds at the same time, compressing everything into forms that no longer behave as they do above. In this environment, the distinction between solid and fluid begins to fade. Rock does not always remain rigid. It bends, flows slowly, responding to forces that act over immense periods. The deeper layers of the Earth move not through abrupt motion, but through a gradual, continuous shifting that never truly stops. Within these layers, elements exist in a state that is both familiar and unfamiliar at once. Carbon is present, as it is on the surface, but it does not remain bound to the same pathways associated with life. Hydrogen is there as well, moving through the system, interacting under conditions that are shaped not by biology, but by physics and chemistry alone. When these elements encounter one another under such pressure and heat, their behavior changes. Bonds form and break in ways that would not occur under normal conditions. Structures begin to emerge, not guided by living processes, but by the environment itself. The interactions are driven by necessity rather than intention, shaped by the forces that dominate this hidden world. It is here that a quiet possibility begins to take form. Hydrocarbons, the same structures found in oil, could arise within these depths, not as remnants of life, but as products of the Earth's internal conditions. The process is not sudden. It unfolds gradually, influenced by temperature, pressure, and the availability of the elements involved. It is not a single event, but a continuous interaction, repeating wherever the conditions allow. What makes this idea more compelling is not just that these conditions exist, but that they are not rare. They are not confined to isolated regions or unusual circumstances. They are a constant feature of the planet's interior, present beneath oceans and continents alike, operating without interruption. This changes the scale of the question. If such processes are possible, then they are not limited to a distant moment in the past. They are not dependent on a specific set of conditions that occurred once and then ended. Instead, they could be happening continuously, shaping substances over time in ways that are largely hidden from view. The thought introduces a different sense of time. Oil is often considered something ancient, formed millions of years ago, and slowly depleted as it is used. But within this deeper perspective, it becomes part of a system that does not belong solely to the past. It becomes something that could, in certain contexts, still be forming, still moving through pathways that connect the deep interior to the surface. This does not suggest abundance in any simple sense. The processes involved are slow, unfolding over geological timescales that extend far beyond immediate human experience. But it does suggest continuity, a system that does not simply end once a resource is created. The Earth, in this view, becomes less of a storage space and more of an active environment, one that continues to generate and transform material beneath the surface. The presence of hydrocarbons is no longer tied exclusively to what once lived, but also to what continues to happen in places that cannot be directly seen. The idea remains careful, balanced between possibility and evidence. It does not replace what is known, but it expands it, offering another layer to consider. It invites the mind to move beyond the surface, to imagine processes that operate quietly and persistently, shaping outcomes over vast stretches of time. And once that perspective begins to settle, another question naturally follows. If hydrocarbons can form deep within the Earth, under conditions that are constant and ongoing, how do they reach the surface? What pathways allow something created so far below to appear in places where it can be discovered, extracted, and used? The answer does not lie in a single moment, but in a journey, one that moves slowly upward through the layers of the planet, guided by fractures, pressure, and time, carrying with it traces of a process that began far beyond direct observation. The movement does not happen quickly. It does not surge upward in visible streams or announce itself in ways that can be easily observed. Instead, it begins far below, within the same depths where pressure and heat shape the formation of hydrocarbons, and continues slowly, guided by pathways that take shape over time. The Earth is not a solid block without interruption. It is layered, fractured, and filled with spaces that form as the planet shifts and adjusts. These spaces are not empty in the way we might imagine. They are networks of tiny openings, cracks, and channels that extend through rock, sometimes connecting regions separated by great depth. Through these pathways, movement becomes possible. Hydrocarbons formed deep within the Earth do not remain fixed in place. Under pressure, they begin to migrate, moving upward through the fractures and porous layers that allow them to pass. The process is not direct. It does not follow a single route. Instead, it unfolds gradually, influenced by the structure of the surrounding rock and the forces acting upon it. At times, the movement slows, trapped temporarily within layers that hold it in place. At other times, it continues, rising through new openings created by shifts in the Earth's structure. The journey is long, often taking millions of years, shaped by conditions that are constantly changing. As these substances move closer to the surface, they encounter environments that differ from the depths below. Pressure decreases, temperature shifts, and the surrounding materials change. These transitions influence how hydrocarbons behave, where they accumulate, and how they are eventually discovered. This accumulation forms what are known as reservoirs. Traditionally, these reservoirs are understood as final destinations, places where oil gathers after completing its journey from ancient biological origins. They are seen as static deposits, filled once and gradually depleted as they are extracted. But this view begins to soften when the idea of continuous movement is considered. If hydrocarbons can form deep within the Earth and migrate upward over time, then reservoirs may not be entirely isolated. They may be part of a larger system, one that remains connected to deeper sources through pathways that are not always visible. This possibility introduces a subtle shift in understanding. There have been observations, quiet and not always emphasized, where certain oil fields appear to behave in unexpected ways. Production declines as expected, then stabilizes, or even increases slightly without clear explanation. These patterns are not universal, and they do not apply to every field, but they exist often enough to raise questions. One explanation suggests that these reservoirs may be receiving additional input from below, replenished over time by hydrocarbons continuing their upward movement. The process would be slow, almost imperceptible, but consistent with the idea of a dynamic system rather than a fixed deposit. This does not mean that all oil fields are constantly refilling or that resources are unlimited. The conditions required for such movement are complex and not always present. But it does suggest that the story may not be as simple as extraction from a finite source that never changes. Instead, it points toward a system that involves both accumulation and movement, where the boundaries between source and reservoir are not always clearly defined. The Earth, in this view, becomes a network rather than a container. Substances form, move, and settle, but they do not necessarily remain where they are first found. They continue to interact with the environment, influenced by forces that operate over long periods, shaping outcomes in ways that are not immediately visible. This perspective does not replace what is already known. It adds to it, introducing a layer of complexity that connects deep processes with surface discoveries. It suggests that what we observe at the surface is part of a much larger cycle, one that extends beyond individual locations and individual moments. And as this idea begins to take hold, the focus shifts once again. Because if oil is not only formed in the past, and not only stored in fixed places, but also moving and possibly replenished over time, then the way it is understood today begins to change. The implications extend beyond theory, touching on how this resource is viewed, valued, and used in the present, opening the door to a new perspective that continues to unfold. Long before the world took on any form that could be recognized, before forests, before oceans filled with life, before even the air carried the balance it holds today, the Earth existed in a state that feels almost impossible to imagine. It was not calm. It was not stable. It was a place defined by constant movement, where change was not occasional, but continuous. The surface shifted under immense forces, shaped by heat rising from deep within. Vast regions of molten rock stretched across the planet, glowing faintly beneath a sky that did not resemble the one we see now. There were no quiet horizons, no steady rhythms, only the slow and relentless unfolding of a world still forming itself. The atmosphere was thick and unfamiliar, filled with gases that would not sustain life as we know it. There was no oxygen in the sense we understand today, no clear boundary between what could support life and what could not. Instead, there was a mixture of elements moving freely, interacting in ways that would later become the foundation of everything that followed. Water existed, but not as something stable or predictable. It appeared, disappeared, and returned again, cycling through forms that shifted with the temperature and pressure of the planet. Oceans began to gather, only to be reshaped by the forces beneath them. Steam rose into the atmosphere, condensed, and fell again, creating a rhythm that was present but not yet settled. Volcanic activity dominated much of the surface. Massive eruptions released heat and material into the air, altering the environment in ways that were both immediate and long-lasting. These were not isolated events. They were part of a larger process, one that continued without pause, shaping the surface and atmosphere together. Time moved differently here, not in the sense that it passed more quickly or slowly, but in the way it was experienced. There were no clear beginnings or endings, no moments that could be easily separated from what came before or after. Everything flowed into everything else, forming a continuous sequence of transformation. And within that transformation, something important was already taking place. The elements that would later become part of more complex systems were already present. Carbon, hydrogen, and other building blocks existed within this shifting environment, moving through cycles that were not yet fully defined. They combined, separated, and recombined, guided by conditions that were still evolving. There was no intention behind these processes, no direction in the way we might think of it, but there was a kind of structure forming, not as a fixed outcome, but as a set of possibilities that would continue to unfold over time. It is easy to imagine that everything important began with life, that the story of the Earth only truly started once living organisms appeared. But this earlier world suggests something different. It shows a planet already active, already creating, already moving through processes that would later support life, but were not dependent on it. In this environment, the foundations of many things were quietly taking shape. Not in recognizable forms, not in ways that could be easily named, but as part of a system that was building itself from the inside out. And as this system continued to evolve, the conditions began to change. The surface cooled in certain regions, the atmosphere slowly shifted, water became more stable, settling into patterns that would last longer than before. The intensity of constant upheaval began, in some places, to soften just enough for something new to emerge. It did not happen suddenly. There was no clear moment when the planet became ready. Instead, it was a gradual transition, a subtle shift from one state to another, guided by processes that had been unfolding since the beginning. And within that shift, something remarkable was approaching, something that would add a new layer to the story, not replacing what had come before, but building upon it in ways that would begin to connect the deep past to everything that followed. It did not begin with complexity. There were no forests, no creatures moving across land, no visible signs that anything alive had taken hold. Instead, life appeared in forms so small and simple that they could not be seen without aid, existing quietly within the waters that had only recently begun to settle. These early organisms did not arrive with intention. They did not change the world in sudden, dramatic ways. Their presence was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet persistent. They lived, multiplied, and faded, repeating a cycle that seemed insignificant in any single moment. but carried a quiet weight over time. Within the oceans, they interacted with their surroundings in ways that were not immediately obvious. They absorbed elements, released others, and slowly altered the composition of the water and the atmosphere above it. These changes did not happen quickly. They unfolded across vast stretches of time, far beyond anything that could be directly observed. And yet, they accumulated. The atmosphere began to shift. Gases that once dominated the air slowly gave way to new balances, influenced by processes that were neither planned nor directed, but simply continued. The oceans changed as well, carrying traces of these interactions within their depths, holding records of transformations that could only be understood much later. Life, in this early form, did not stand apart from the planet. It was part of it, woven into the same processes that shaped the surface, the atmosphere, and the movement of elements. It did not control these processes, but it influenced them, adding another layer to a system that was already in motion. Over time, the accumulation of organic material began to increase. As these microscopic organisms lived and died, their remains settled into the layers below, becoming part of the growing complexity of the Earth's surface. These layers held more than just material. They held the traces of processes that had unfolded slowly, quietly, and without interruption. It is here that the familiar explanation begins to take shape. The idea that these accumulated remains, buried and transformed over time, could become the source of oil feels intuitive. It connects life to energy, the past to the present, in a way that seems complete. The transformation from organic matter to hydrocarbons offers a pathway that is both logical and supported by observation. And yet, even within this explanation, something remains open. The scale of what is observed does not always align neatly with the simplicity of the process. The vastness of certain oil deposits, the distribution across different regions, the conditions in which they are found, all suggest a level of complexity that extends beyond a single pathway. Life clearly plays a role. Its presence, its accumulation, and its interaction with the environment contribute to the formation of substances that resemble what we recognize as oil. This part of the story is not uncertain, but whether it is the entire story is something that becomes less clear the longer it is considered. There is a quiet distinction between contributing to a process and fully explaining it. The remains of early life may provide material, may influence conditions, may shape outcomes. But the transformation of that material, especially at the scales observed, raises questions that do not settle easily into a single explanation. What if life did not create oil in isolation, but instead interacted with processes that were already in motion? The thought does not dismiss the role of biology. Instead, it expands the context in which it exists. It suggests that life may be part of a larger system, one that includes chemical and geological processes that operate beyond the surface, beyond what can be directly seen. This perspective does not replace the familiar story. It sits alongside it, adding depth, introducing uncertainty, and inviting further exploration. The early organisms continue their quiet presence in this narrative, not as the sole origin of something, but as participants in a system that is more complex than it first appears. Their legacy is not just in what they became, but in how they interacted with the world around them, shaping conditions that would influence what followed. And as this understanding begins to take form, the focus naturally shifts. Because if life is only part of the story, then the rest must lie somewhere else. Not on the surface, not within the visible layers, but deeper, within the parts of the Earth that continue to move and change beyond direct observation, where forces operate on scales that are difficult to imagine, yet impossible to ignore. Beneath the surface, far below the layers that hold the visible history of life, the Earth continues to move in ways that are rarely imagined. It is not still. It is not quiet. It is active, shaped by forces that do not pause, guided by conditions that remain beyond direct reach. The deeper one goes, the less familiar everything becomes. Temperature rises steadily, pressure increases until it reshapes the very nature of matter, and the distinction between solid and fluid begins to blur. Rocks bend slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though time itself has softened their structure. In this environment, the rules that govern the surface no longer apply in the same way. Elements are not fixed. They move, combine, and separate under conditions that are both extreme and continuous. Carbon and hydrogen, The same building blocks associated with life exist here as well, but they are not dependent on biology to interact. They respond to heat, to pressure, to the deep chemistry of the planet itself. These interactions are not isolated events. They are part of a system that has been operating since the Earth first began to form. A system that continues without interruption, shaping substances that may never reach the surface or may take millions of years to do so. It is within this context that another possibility begins to emerge. Not as a contradiction to what has already been understood, but as an extension of it. A suggestion that hydrocarbons, the core components of oil, could form here, deep within the Earth, through processes that do not rely on the remains of living organisms. The idea does not appear suddenly. It develops slowly, supported by observations, experiments, and patterns that hint at something more complex beneath the surface. Scientists studying high-pressure environments have recreated conditions similar to those found deep within the Earth, observing how simple elements can transform into more complex compounds. The results are not always definitive, but they are enough to raise a quiet question. If hydrocarbons can form under these conditions, in controlled settings, what might be happening within the vast, uncontrolled environment of the Earth's interior? The thought shifts the perspective. Oil is no longer viewed only as something that originated from the distant past, formed once and preserved over time. It becomes part of an ongoing process, something that could, in theory, still be forming, still evolving, still moving through pathways that connect the deep interior to the surface. This does not erase the role of biology. The remains of ancient life, buried and transformed, still hold a place within the story, but they are no longer the only possible source. They become one pathway among others, part of a system that may be more layered than previously understood. And within that layered system, a new kind of possibility begins to take shape. What if some of the oil we find today did not originate solely from ancient life, but from processes that continue beneath the surface even now? What if the Earth is not simply storing what was created long ago, but actively generating substances that rise slowly over time? The idea is not presented as certainty. It remains open, still being explored, still debated. But its presence changes the way the story feels. It introduces movement where there was once stillness, continuity where there was once a clear beginning. The Earth, in this view, is not just a container of resources. It is a system that creates, transforms, and redistributes, operating on timescales that extend far beyond immediate perception. And once that perspective settles in, it becomes difficult to return to a simpler explanation. Because the deeper processes do not stop. They continue, unseen, shaping outcomes that only become visible much later, when they reach the surface in forms that seem familiar, but carry with them a history that is far more complex than it first appears. From here, the narrative begins to shift again, moving away from possibility and toward observation, toward the places where these ideas meet reality, where evidence begins to surface, quietly revealing patterns that demand a closer look. The deeper the story reaches, the quieter it becomes. Not because there is less happening, but because what lies beneath cannot be seen in the way we are used to seeing. The surface of the Earth offers evidence, landforms, rocks, shifting boundaries that can be mapped and studied. But beyond a certain depth, direct observation fades, replaced by inference and interpretation. No human has traveled into the regions where many of these processes are believed to occur. The environments are too extreme, the conditions too intense. Heat rises beyond what materials can withstand. Pressure increases beyond what structures can endure. These are places that remain out of reach, not just physically, but visually. And so, understanding must come from elsewhere. Scientists listen rather than look. They study how waves move through the Earth, how vibrations travel and change as they pass through different layers. From these patterns, they build images of what cannot be seen, outlines of structures that exist far below the surface. They examine fragments brought upward over time. Rocks carried from deep within, altered by their journey, offer small glimpses into conditions that would otherwise remain hidden. These pieces are studied carefully, their composition analyzed, their structure interpreted as clues to a larger environment. Laboratories attempt to recreate what exists below. Pressure is applied, temperature increased, elements combined under controlled conditions. These experiments provide insight, showing how materials behave when subjected to forces similar to those deep within the Earth. But none of these methods offer direct access. They provide signals, fragments, approximations. They allow for understanding to develop, but always through a layer of interpretation. What is known is shaped by what can be measured, and what can be measured is limited by the tools available. This does not weaken science, it defines it. Understanding grows within boundaries, expanding as new methods are developed, as new data becomes available. But those boundaries remain, shifting slowly, never disappearing entirely. There is always a space between what is observed and what exists. And it is within that space that uncertainty quietly lives. The origin of oil, like many deep earth processes, sits partly within that space. The pathways that lead from formation to accumulation, the conditions that shape hydrocarbons at great depth, the interactions that occur over immense periods of time, all extend beyond direct observation. They are inferred, supported by evidence, connected through models that make sense of what can be detected. But they are not fully seen. This creates a subtle tension. The explanations that exist are strong, built on careful study and repeated observation. They provide a framework that allows for understanding and prediction. But they are also shaped by the limits of what can be known, by the boundaries that define how far observation can reach. It is possible that key parts of the story remain hidden, not because they are intentionally concealed, but because they exist in places where current methods cannot fully access them. This idea does not diminish what has been learned. It places it in context. It suggests that knowledge is always partial, always evolving, always open to refinement as new ways of observing emerge. It acknowledges that the deeper the question goes, the more it encounters regions where certainty becomes more difficult to maintain. And within that realization, something shifts. The search for a complete answer begins to soften, not because the question loses importance, but because it becomes clear that some aspects may not yet be fully reachable, that the story may extend into areas where understanding is still forming, still incomplete. The thought is not unsettling in a dramatic way. It is quieter than that. It invites patience, a willingness to accept that not everything can be fully known at once, that some parts of the story remain just beyond the edge of observation, waiting for new methods, new insights, new ways of seeing. And as this understanding settles, the focus begins to move again, because where direct observation ends, something else begins to take shape. Models, assumptions, and interpretations step in to fill the gaps, creating structures of understanding that attempt to connect what is known with what is not, forming a bridge between evidence and possibility. When direct observation fades, understanding does not stop. It changes form. In place of what can be seen, models begin to take shape, not as exact representations of reality, but as structured ways of interpreting it. They are built from fragments of evidence, connected through logic, shaped by patterns that appear consistent across different observations. A model is, at its core, an attempt to bridge a gap. It gathers what is known measurements, experiments, field data, and arranges it into a framework that can explain how processes might work beneath the surface. Geological layers are mapped, chemical reactions are simulated, physical forces are calculated, all woven together into systems that can be studied and refined. These models allow scientists to move forward, to make predictions, to test ideas against new evidence. They provide a sense of structure in places where direct access is not possible. But they are not fixed. Over time, as new data emerges, models change. They are adjusted, expanded, sometimes replaced. What once seemed complete may later appear incomplete, not because it was wrong, but because it captured only part of a larger picture. This is especially true when it comes to something as complex as the origin of oil. The traditional model, built around the transformation of ancient biological material, explains many observations. It aligns with the presence of organic compounds, with the structure of sedimentary basins, with patterns that have been confirmed across different regions. But as new evidence appears, other models begin to form alongside it. Some focus on deep earth processes, suggesting that hydrocarbons can originate far below the surface, shaped by heat and pressure rather than biological decay. Others explore how these processes might interact, how material from different sources could combine, migrate, and accumulate in ways that blur the boundaries between origins. Each model carries its own strength. Each explains certain patterns, certain observations that align with its framework, but none of them explains everything. This is where the understanding becomes layered. Instead of a single explanation that accounts for all cases, multiple models exist together, each revealing part of the story. In some regions, the biological model may align closely with what is observed. In others, deeper processes may offer a better explanation. In many cases, both may play a role, interacting in ways that are not fully separated. The idea of coexistence replaces the idea of exclusivity. This does not mean that anything is possible, or that all explanations carry equal weight. It means that understanding is shaped by evidence, and evidence does not always point in a single direction. It can suggest multiple pathways, multiple processes unfolding at the same time or in sequence. For those seeking certainty, this can feel incomplete. There is a natural tendency to look for a single answer, a clear origin that defines everything that follows. But the deeper the story goes, the more it resists that simplicity. It becomes less about choosing one explanation over another, and more about understanding how different processes may connect. This shift changes the way the question itself is approached. Instead of asking where oil comes from, in a singular sense, the question expands. It becomes an exploration of how it can form, under what conditions, through what interactions. The focus moves from a fixed origin to a dynamic system. And within that system, models are not endpoints. They are tools that guide exploration, frameworks that help interpret what is found. They are useful, necessary, but always open to revision. Their strength lies not in being final, but in being adaptable. This adaptability reflects something deeper about the nature of discovery. Knowledge does not arrive all at once. It builds gradually, shaped by what is observed and what remains uncertain. It evolves as new information becomes available, as new perspectives are considered. The presence of multiple models is not a sign of confusion. It is a sign that the system being studied is complex, that it cannot be fully captured by a single explanation. And as this realization begins to settle, it influences more than just understanding. It shapes how exploration is approached, how decisions are made, how new discoveries are interpreted. Because when multiple possibilities exist, the path forward becomes less about following a single direction and more about navigating between them, allowing uncertainty to guide the search rather than limit it. Uncertainty is often seen as something to avoid, a gap in knowledge that must be closed as quickly as possible. But within the story of exploration, it begins to take on a different meaning. It becomes less of a limitation and more of a starting point. In the search for oil, certainty provides direction. Models guide where to drill, data shapes, expectations, and patterns suggest where resources are most likely to be found. These elements create a sense of order, a structure that allows decisions to be made with confidence. And yet, some of the most significant discoveries do not follow that structure. They appear in moments when expectation and outcome do not align. A well is drilled based on established understanding, and the result does not match what was predicted. Sometimes there is less than expected, but at other times there is more. In certain cases, there is something entirely unanticipated. These moments could be seen as errors, as miscalculations within the system, but they are often approached differently. They are examined. Engineers and geologists look closely at what happened, not to dismiss it, but to understand it. They revisit assumptions, reconsider data, and explore alternative explanations. The unexpected result becomes a point of focus, not something to be ignored, but something to be learned from. Over time, a pattern begins to emerge. Discoveries are not always the result of following a model precisely. They often occur when that model is questioned, adjusted, or temporarily set aside. When exploration moves beyond what is expected, it creates space for new possibilities to appear. This does not mean that structure is abandoned. It means that flexibility becomes part of the process. Uncertainty, in this sense, becomes a guide. It points toward areas that require deeper attention, toward patterns that have not yet been fully understood. It encourages exploration beyond the limits of existing explanations, allowing for outcomes that would not have been considered otherwise. There are instances where fields have been discovered in places that did not align with standard predictions. Locations that were initially overlooked, or considered unlikely, later revealed significant resources. These discoveries did not emerge from certainty alone. They came from a willingness to explore beyond it. The same applies to the behavior of certain reservoirs. Flows that change over time, production patterns that do not follow expected declines, characteristics that resist simple explanation. These observations introduce questions that cannot be answered by a single model, requiring a broader perspective. Rather than closing those questions, exploration continues around them. This creates a different kind of progress. Not one that moves in a straight line from question to answer, but one that expands outward, shaped by curiosity and adaptation. Each unexpected result becomes part of a larger pattern, contributing to a deeper understanding that develops gradually. The idea that oil's origin is not fully resolved fits naturally within this framework. It is not a problem to be solved once and completed. It is part of an ongoing process, one that evolves as new evidence appears, as new perspectives are considered. The presence of uncertainty does not weaken the search, it sustains it. Because as long as there are questions that remain open, there is space for discovery to continue. The story, then, is not about reaching a final conclusion. It is about movement, about the way understanding shifts and grows over time. It is shaped by both what is known and what is not, by the balance between certainty and doubt. And in that balance, something deeper begins to take form. The realization that the search itself may extend beyond the boundaries of the Earth. That the processes being explored are not isolated, but connected to patterns that exist on a much larger scale. As uncertainty becomes a driving force rather than an obstacle, the narrative begins to expand outward, moving beyond the planet, toward influences that may originate far beyond its surface, yet remain connected to everything that has been discovered so far. The present feels certain. Systems are built, decisions are made, and entire industries move forward based on what is believed to be known. Oil, in this framework, has long been understood as a resource that comes from the past, formed under specific conditions, stored in limited quantities, and gradually reduced as it is used. This understanding carries a quiet sense of urgency. If something takes millions of years to form, then what exists today must be finite. Each extraction becomes a step toward depletion, each use a movement closer to an eventual end. The idea feels logical, grounded in the story that connects oil to ancient life and the slow transformation that followed. Over time, this perspective shapes more than just scientific thought. It influences how resources are managed, how economies are structured, how long-term plans are made. The assumption of scarcity becomes part of the foundation, guiding decisions in ways that are rarely questioned. And yet, as the story deepens, that foundation begins to feel less certain. Not because it is entirely incorrect, but because it may not be complete. If oil can form through more than one process, if it is not solely the result of ancient biological material, then the idea of a fixed, unchanging supply becomes more complex. The boundaries that define what is available and what is not begin to soften, opening space for possibilities that were not previously considered. This does not immediately change reality. Oil fields do not suddenly become endless, nor does the process of extraction lose its limits. The Earth does not reveal its deeper systems in ways that can be easily measured or predicted. But the perspective shifts. Scarcity, once seen as an absolute, begins to appear as something influenced by understanding. What is considered limited may depend not only on what exists, but on how it is explained. The models that define availability are shaped by assumptions, and when those assumptions change, even slightly, the conclusions they produce begin to shift as well. There is a difference between something being finite and something being fully understood. If the origin of oil involves multiple pathways, some of which may still be active beneath the surface, then the question is no longer simply how much exists, but how it is being formed, how it moves, and how it accumulates over time. The idea introduces a different kind of uncertainty, not one that removes limits, but one that redefines them. It suggests that what appears fixed may, in some cases, be part of a larger system that continues to evolve. That depletion may not always be a straight path from full to empty, but a process influenced by factors that are not always visible. This perspective does not provide immediate answers. It does not replace one certainty with another. Instead, it encourages a quieter form of reflection. How much of what is believed about scarcity is based on what is known, and how much is shaped by what has not yet been fully explored. The thought does not dismiss the need for caution or careful use. It does not suggest that resources should be treated as unlimited, but it does invite a reconsideration of how those limits are defined and whether they are as fixed as they seem. Because if the story of oil is still unfolding, if its origins are more complex than once believed, then the idea of scarcity may also be part of that evolving narrative. Not an illusion in the sense that it is false, but in the sense that it may not represent the entire picture. And once that possibility begins to settle, it leads naturally to another question. If understanding shapes perception, and perception shapes decisions, how has the industry itself responded to these uncertainties? How does it operate within a system where what is known and what is possible do not always align perfectly? The answer lies not in a single approach, but in a balance between certainty and doubt, where practice continues even as questions remain. The industry moves forward with a sense of confidence, guided by models that have been refined over decades. Maps are drawn, data is analyzed, and decisions are made based on patterns that have proven reliable in many cases. The process feels structured, almost predictable, as though each step follows a path that has already been carefully outlined. And in many ways it does. The traditional understanding of oil formation provides a foundation that supports exploration. It defines where to look, how to interpret geological structures, and what signs to follow when searching beneath the surface. These methods have led to countless discoveries, reinforcing the belief that the system is well understood. But beneath that confidence, something quieter exists. Exploration does not always follow the plan. Wells are drilled based on expectation, yet the results can differ in ways that are not easily explained. Sometimes oil is found where it should not be. Sometimes it is absent where it was expected. These moments do not disrupt the entire system, but they introduce a subtle tension between what is predicted and what is observed. The response is not to abandon the models, but to adjust them. Geologists and engineers adapt, refining their understanding based on new data. They consider alternative pathways, re-examine structures, and look for explanations that can account for the unexpected. This process is continuous, shaped by both success and uncertainty. Over time, a pattern begins to emerge. Practice does not always align perfectly with theory. The decisions made in the field are often influenced by observations that extend beyond the standard explanation. Subtle shifts in strategy occur, guided by experience rather than strict adherence to a single model. In some cases, exploration moves deeper than originally intended, reaching into formations that were not initially considered likely sources. In others, attention is given to areas where the geological history does not fully match the expected conditions, yet still shows signs of potential. These choices are not always framed in terms of alternative theories. They are often described as adjustments, refinements, or responses to specific conditions. But within them, there is an implicit recognition that the system may be more complex than a single explanation can capture. This is where the boundary between certainty and doubt becomes less defined. The industry does not operate in complete uncertainty. It relies on knowledge, on data, on models that continue to provide valuable guidance. But it also does not operate in complete certainty. It leaves room for the unexpected, for results that require interpretation rather than immediate explanation. This balance shapes how exploration unfolds. It allows for flexibility, for the possibility that what is found may not always fit neatly within established ideas. It encourages a form of thinking that is both structured and open, grounded in evidence, but responsive to new information. And within that balance, something interesting begins to take shape. Some of the strategies used in exploration begin to resemble ideas that extend beyond the traditional biological model. Not explicitly, not in a way that is always acknowledged, but in the way decisions are made, in the willingness to explore deeper formations, in the recognition that hydrocarbons may be present in places that do not fit the original expectations. It is not presented as a shift in theory. It appears more as an adaptation in practice. But the effect is the same. The boundaries of where oil might be found begin to expand, influenced not only by what has been established, but by what has been observed. The system becomes more flexible, more responsive, shaped by both certainty and doubt. This suggests something important. That uncertainty is not a limitation, but a source of movement. It allows the industry to continue discovering, to refine its approach, to respond to patterns that are not yet fully understood. It creates space for new ideas to exist, even if they are not immediately formalized within the dominant explanation. The knowledge guiding exploration is not static. It evolves, shaped by the interaction between theory and observation, between expectation and reality. And as this interaction continues, the focus begins to shift once again. Because the way the industry operates reflects something deeper about how the Earth itself is understood. It reveals that the planet is not fully predictable, not entirely captured by existing models. It suggests that there are processes still unfolding, still influencing outcomes in ways that are not completely defined. From here, the narrative moves beyond the industry, beyond the methods and decisions, toward the broader implications of this uncertainty, toward a deeper reflection on the nature of the Earth and the systems that continue to shape it. The story does not settle into a conclusion. It widens instead, moving beyond the substance that first brought attention to it, and toward the system that holds it all together. Oil, once seen as a resource with a clear beginning and a predictable end, begins to feel like something else entirely. Not just a material, but a signal. A signal that points toward processes that are still unfolding, still shaping outcomes in ways that are not fully understood. The deeper the story moves, the less it feels like a closed explanation, and the more it resembles an open system, one that continues to evolve without reaching a final state. The Earth, in this sense, is not finished. It does not exist as something that formed long ago and has remained unchanged ever since. It continues to move, to shift, to create conditions that lead to new outcomes. The surface may appear stable, the patterns of daily life may feel consistent, but beneath that familiarity, the same forces that shaped the earliest stages of the planet are still active. Heat continues to rise from within. Pressure continues to build and release. Elements continue to interact, combining and separating in ways that extend far beyond immediate observation. These processes do not pause. They do not wait for recognition. They simply continue. And within that continuation, substances like oil take on a different meaning. They are no longer just remnants of a distant past, preserved and slowly depleted. They become part of a system that includes both history and ongoing transformation. Part of a cycle that does not fully belong to any single moment, but spans across time in a way that connects what has already happened with what is still to come. This perspective introduces a quieter kind of realization, that even the most familiar things may carry layers of complexity that are not immediately visible. That what appears simple at the surface may be connected to processes that extend far beyond what can be easily explained. Oil, in this sense, becomes less about what it is and more about what it represents. A reminder that understanding is always partial, that the models and explanations used to describe the world are shaped by what can be observed but may not capture everything that exists. That beneath every explanation, there may be additional layers waiting to be explored, not in opposition to what is known, but as part of a larger, more intricate system. This does not diminish what has been discovered. It does not reduce the value of existing knowledge. Instead, it places that knowledge within a broader context, where certainty and uncertainty exist together, each informing the other. The Earth, viewed in this way, becomes something more than a background for human activity. It becomes an active participant in an ongoing process, one that continues to produce outcomes that are not always predictable, not always fully understood. And oil, rather than being a finished product of the past, becomes a glimpse into that process. A trace of something deeper, something that connects the surface to the interior, the present to the past, and possibly even to what is still forming. The realization does not arrive as a conclusion. It arrives as an opening. A recognition that the story is not complete, and may never be. That each answer leads to another question, each discovery revealing something that was not previously considered. The narrative does not end because the system it describes does not stop. It continues, quietly, beneath everything. And as this understanding begins to settle, the direction of the story shifts once more. The focus moves beyond the surface of the Earth, beyond the processes that can be inferred from observation, toward forces that extend even further, into spaces that are less familiar, less defined, yet still connected to everything that has been explored so far. The next step is not just deeper, but broader. reaching into the unknown in search of connections that may reshape the story once again. The present returns, but it no longer feels the same. What once appeared fixed now carries a quiet sense of movement, as though the understanding of energy itself has shifted beneath the surface. Oil, long seen as a resource tied to the distant past, begins to feel less like something that is simply used and depleted, and more like something connected to processes that continue beyond immediate perception. This does not change how it is used today. Engines still run, materials are still produced, systems continue to rely on what has already been established. The structure of modern life remains largely unchanged, but the meaning behind that structure begins to evolve. If oil is not solely the result of ancient biological processes, if it may also form through ongoing interactions within the Earth, then the idea of time attached to it becomes more complex. It is no longer just a substance from millions of years ago. It becomes something that may exist across multiple timescales, shaped by both past and present conditions. This introduces a different way of thinking about energy, not as something that belongs entirely to history, but as something that may still be part of an active system. The distinction between what has already formed and what may still be forming begins to blur, creating a perspective that is less absolute and more open. The implications are subtle. They do not immediately redefine how resources are managed or how energy systems operate, but they begin to influence the way those systems are understood. The assumption of strict limitation, based on a single origin, starts to feel less certain. In its place, a more layered understanding emerges, one that allows for complexity rather than simplicity. This does not suggest abundance without limit. The processes involved remain slow, shaped by conditions that are not easily controlled or predicted. Even if formation continues, it does so on timescales that extend far beyond immediate use. But it does suggest that the relationship between humanity and this resource may not be as straightforward as it once seemed. Energy, in this sense, becomes more than a matter of supply. It becomes a reflection of how knowledge shapes perception. The way a resource is understood influences how it is valued, how it is used, how it is planned for over time. When that understanding changes, even slightly, the perspective surrounding it begins to shift as well. This shift is not about replacing one idea with another. It is about expanding the framework, allowing for the possibility that what was once seen as fixed may be part of a larger system that continues to evolve. It invites a reconsideration of assumptions, not through contradiction, but through the introduction of additional layers. The future of energy, then, may not depend solely on discovering something entirely new. It may also depend on how existing resources are interpreted, how their origins are understood, how their place within the broader system is viewed. The question is no longer just what will replace oil, but how oil itself is understood within the context of a changing perspective. This creates a quieter kind of possibility, one that does not rely on sudden breakthroughs, but on gradual shifts in understanding. It suggests that the path forward may involve not only innovation, but reinterpretation, a deeper awareness of the systems that already exist. The thought does not resolve into a conclusion. It remains open, allowing space for different possibilities to unfold. It recognizes that understanding is still developing, that the story is still being written, and that the way forward may involve questions that have not yet been fully asked. And as this perspective begins to settle, another shift follows. Because if the understanding of energy can change, then the way exploration is approached may change as well. The search for resources, once guided by fixed assumptions, may begin to adapt, influenced by a broader view of how substances form, move, and exist within the Earth. The next step is not just about what is found, but how the search itself evolves, shaped by the same uncertainty and curiosity that have guided the story from the beginning. Exploration has always followed a pattern. It begins with what is known, builds upon it, and moves outward into what is not. Maps are drawn, models are applied, and decisions are guided by expectations shaped over time. For decades, this approach has led to discovery, refining the search, and narrowing the focus to places where oil is most likely to be found. But as understanding shifts, so does the direction of that search. The idea that oil may form through more than one process introduces a subtle change in perspective. It does not erase existing methods, but it expands them. Areas once considered unlikely begin to feel less certain in their dismissal. Depths that were previously overlooked begin to draw attention. The question is no longer only where oil has been found before, but where it might exist under conditions that were not fully considered. This shift does not arrive all at once. It unfolds gradually, as new observations are made, as unexpected results continue to appear. The process remains careful, grounded in evidence, but it becomes more open to possibility. Exploration begins to move differently. Instead of following a single set of assumptions, it starts to incorporate multiple perspectives. Geological structures are examined not only for signs of past biological activity, but also for conditions that might support deeper processes. The focus extends downward, toward regions that were once thought to be beyond the reach of conventional understanding. At the same time, attention turns inward, toward places that have already been explored. Fields that were once considered exhausted begin to be reconsidered. Not as sources that will suddenly produce vast new quantities, but as systems that may not be as static as they once appeared. Subtle changes in production, patterns that do not fully align with expectations, begin to take on new meaning. These are not immediate transformations. They require time, observation, and careful interpretation. But they suggest that exploration is not only about moving outward into new territory. It is also about looking again at what has already been seen, with a different perspective. This introduces a quiet but important shift. Discovery is no longer defined solely by location. It becomes defined by understanding. The same place, viewed through a different framework, can reveal something that was not recognized before. The boundaries of what is possible begin to expand, not because the Earth has changed, but because the way it is interpreted has. This does not remove uncertainty. It increases it in some ways. But that uncertainty becomes part of the process, guiding exploration rather than limiting it. It encourages a form of thinking that remains flexible, that allows for adjustment as new information becomes available. Engineers and scientists begin to navigate between what is established and what is emerging. They rely on models, but they are not confined by them. They follow patterns, but they remain aware that those patterns may not capture everything. They explore with intention, but also with openness, allowing for outcomes that are not fully predicted. This balance shapes the next phase of exploration. It is not defined by a single breakthrough or a sudden change in direction. It is shaped by gradual shifts, by the accumulation of observations that begin to alter how the system is understood. It reflects a process that continues to evolve, influenced by both knowledge and imagination. The Earth, in this context, becomes less predictable, but also more intriguing. It reveals itself not as something that has been fully mapped, but as something that still holds layers of complexity waiting to be explored. Each new discovery, each unexpected result, contributes to a deeper understanding that is never fully complete. And within that understanding, exploration finds a new purpose. Not just to locate resources, but to understand the processes that shape them. To move beyond surface patterns and into the systems that operate beneath, connecting different layers of knowledge into a broader view. This perspective does not conclude the search. It extends it. It suggests that what lies ahead is not only a matter of finding new places, but of seeing familiar places in new ways. That discovery may come as much from reinterpretation as from expansion, from the willingness to question what is already known. And as this idea settles, the focus begins to shift once more. Because exploration is not only about what is found, it reflects how the Earth itself is understood. The changes in approach, the adjustments in perspective, all point toward a deeper realization about the nature of the planet, one that continues to unfold as the story moves forward. The movement never stops. Even when nothing appears to change, even when the surface remains calm and familiar, the deeper processes continue without interruption. The Earth does not pause between chapters. It does not wait for understanding to catch up. It carries on, quietly, steadily, shaping outcomes that may not become visible for ages. What has been explored so far begins to settle into a different kind of awareness. Oil is no longer just a resource, no longer just a substance tied to engines and materials and daily life. It becomes something else, something that reflects the deeper behavior of the planet itself. A trace of processes that extend beyond immediate perception, beyond what can be easily measured or fully explained. The story shifts from explanation to observation. The Earth continues to move. Beneath oceans and continents, pressure builds and releases, elements interact, pathways form and change. These processes do not announce themselves. They unfold slowly, often unnoticed, yet they remain constant, shaping the conditions that define what exists at the surface. Hydrocarbons, whether formed through biological transformation or deeper geological processes, remain part of this ongoing system. They are not separate from it. They are expressions of it. The idea that oil may still be forming, still moving, still influenced by forces that operate far below, does not arrive as a definitive statement. It remains a possibility, supported by patterns, by observations, by the quiet accumulation of evidence that suggests the system is more active than it once appeared. This possibility changes the tone of the story. It removes the sense of finality. Instead of something that began long ago and is now simply being used, oil becomes part of a process that continues. It exists within a system that does not end, one that evolves gradually, shaped by forces that extend far beyond immediate awareness. The Earth, in this view, is not finished. It is still creating, still transforming, still holding within it processes that have not been fully revealed. The deeper the perspective moves, the more it becomes clear that understanding is only a partial reflection of what exists. This does not create distance, it creates connection. It links what is seen at the surface to what remains hidden below, forming a continuous thread that runs through everything that has been explored. The familiar becomes connected to the unknown, the present linked to processes that extend across time. The story, then, is not something that has been completed. It is something that continues to unfold. Each layer of understanding adds to it, each new observation shaping the way it is perceived. But the full picture remains just beyond reach, not because it is unattainable, but because it is still in motion. This realization is not unsettling. It is quiet, almost calming in its presence. It suggests that there is no need for a final answer, no requirement for complete certainty. The system does not depend on being fully understood in order to continue. It operates on its own terms, following patterns that exist regardless of how they are interpreted. And within that continuity, there is space for curiosity. A space where questions remain open, where possibilities are allowed to exist without immediate resolution. The story of oil becomes part of a larger narrative, one that includes not only what has been discovered, but what remains to be explored. The sense of mystery does not fade. It deepens. It becomes less about what is unknown, and more about the recognition that there will always be something beyond what is currently understood. That each answer leads to another layer, another perspective, another question that invites further exploration. And as this awareness settles, the direction of the story begins to shift once more. The pieces that have been introduced, biological origins, deep earth processes, cosmic connections, the limits of observation, the evolving nature of understanding, begin to move toward one another. Not to form a single conclusion, but to create a broader view where each part contributes to a more complete perspective. The final chapters do not aim to close the story. They aim to bring it together, to reflect on what has been uncovered, to consider what it means, and to leave space for what remains beyond the edge of understanding, where the Earth continues its quiet work, shaping a story that is still being written beneath every step. The story begins to change when theory meets the ground itself. Not in a dramatic moment, not in a single discovery that overturns everything at once, but in a series of quiet observations made over time. Wells are drilled, as they have been for decades, guided by models that predict where oil should be found. In many cases, those models work. The process feels reliable, almost routine. And then, occasionally, something unexpected appears. A well reaches deeper than intended, passing through layers that were not expected to contain anything of value. The drill moves beyond sedimentary rock, beyond the zones where ancient organic material would have settled, and enters regions that are older, harder, and far less likely to hold what is being searched for. These deeper layers are different. They are crystalline, formed under conditions that predate the environments where life once thrived. They do not carry the same history, the same accumulation of biological material that the standard explanation relies upon. And yet, in some of these places, oil is found. At first, such discoveries are treated with caution. They are examined carefully, sometimes attributed to migration from higher layers, where oil may have formed in the expected way before moving downward through fractures in the rock. This explanation offers a sense of continuity, allowing the anomaly to fit within the existing framework. But as time passes, similar findings begin to appear in different locations. Wells drilled into deep ancient rock formations reveal traces of hydrocarbons where none were expected. In some cases, the quantities are not insignificant. They are not small, isolated pockets that can be easily dismissed. They are substantial enough to raise quiet questions among those who encounter them. These questions do not spread quickly. They remain within technical reports, within discussions among geologists and engineers, within observations that are recorded but not widely emphasized. The discoveries are real, but they do not immediately reshape the broader understanding. Still, they remain. The tension begins to build not from a single contradiction, but from repetition. The same pattern appearing in different places, under different conditions, yet leading to similar outcomes. Oil in locations that do not align with the expected origin. Oil in depths where life, as it is understood, could not have contributed in any direct way. It is not that the standard explanation fails entirely. It continues to account for many discoveries, continues to guide exploration with a high degree of success. But these deeper wells introduce something else, something that does not fit as easily. A quiet imbalance between expectation and observation. If oil is primarily the result of ancient life, buried and transformed within specific geological conditions, then its presence should follow those conditions closely. It should appear where those environments once existed, where the necessary material and processes were present. But in these cases, it does not. Instead, it appears in places that seem disconnected from that history. Places where the geological record tells a different story, one that does not include the accumulation of organic material in the way the model requires. This does not immediately lead to a new conclusion. The response is more careful than that. It leads to reconsideration, to the possibility that something else may be influencing the outcome, something not fully accounted for in the existing explanation. And as more of these wells are examined, the sense of isolation begins to fade. They are no longer seen as rare exceptions, but as part of a broader pattern that has been observed across different regions of the world. Not everywhere, not in a way that replaces what is already known, but consistently enough to suggest that they are not accidents. They are signals. Signals that point toward processes that may extend deeper than previously considered. Processes that do not depend entirely on the surface history of life, but may originate from within the Earth itself. The idea does not fully form here. It remains incomplete, still surrounded by uncertainty, but it becomes difficult to ignore. Because once the pattern is seen, it changes the way each new discovery is viewed. It shifts the focus from where oil is expected to be to where it appears regardless of expectation. And in that shift, the story begins to move again, away from what is assumed and toward how these anomalies have been interpreted, explored, and sometimes quietly debated, revealing a layer of scientific thought that does not always reach the surface, but continues to shape the search for understanding. The questions did not remain with the wells alone. They moved with the people who studied them, carried quietly into offices, laboratories, and long discussions that rarely reached beyond small circles. For some, the inconsistencies were simply part of a complex system, details to be refined over time. For others, they became something more difficult to ignore. These were not individuals seeking to overturn everything that was known. They did not begin with the intention of replacing one explanation with another. Instead, they followed the evidence as it appeared, allowing observations to guide their thinking, even when those observations did not align with what was expected. In many cases, their work began in the same way as others. They studied rock formations, analyzed samples, examined the distribution of hydrocarbons across different regions. The methods were familiar, grounded in established practice, but the conclusions they reached did not always remain within those boundaries. Some began to consider a different possibility, not as a rejection of the biological origin of oil, but as an addition to it, a suggestion that hydrocarbons could form deep within the Earth, under conditions of high pressure and temperature, without requiring the remains of ancient life. The idea was not entirely new. It had been proposed in various forms over time, appearing in different regions, explored by different researchers. But it had never fully entered the center of mainstream understanding. It remained at the edges, acknowledged but not widely adopted. What made these scientists different was not the idea itself, but the way they approached it. They did not present it as speculation alone. They looked for patterns that could support it, for evidence that could be tested, for ways to connect deep Earth processes with the anomalies that had been observed. They studied how simple elements behaved under extreme conditions, how carbon and hydrogen interacted when subjected to pressures far beyond what could be experienced at the surface. Some of their findings were unexpected. In controlled environments, under carefully designed experiments, it was possible to produce hydrocarbons from inorganic materials. The conditions required were not easily replicated outside the laboratory, but they were consistent with what might exist deep within the Earth. These results did not prove that oil formed this way naturally, but they opened a possibility that had not been fully considered before. Alongside these experiments, geological observations began to take on new meaning. The presence of hydrocarbons in deep, crystalline rocks, the patterns of migration through fractures that extended far below sedimentary layers, the scale of certain deposits that seemed difficult to explain through biological accumulation alone, all began to align with this alternative perspective. Still, acceptance did not come easily. Scientific understanding does not shift quickly, especially when existing models continue to explain a large portion of observed data. The biological origin of oil remained strong, supported by evidence that could not be dismissed. The new perspective did not replace it, but it did not fully integrate with it either. This created a quiet tension. The idea of abiotic formation, of oil generated through non-biological processes, existed alongside the dominant theory without fully merging into it. It was discussed, debated, sometimes supported, sometimes questioned. It moved through scientific literature without becoming a central conclusion. And yet, it persisted. Decade after decade, the idea remained present. It did not disappear, did not fade entirely. It continued to reappear in different forms, supported by new observations, revisited through new experiments. It was never fully rejected, but it was never fully embraced. This is where the story becomes more subtle, because it suggests that the question is not simply about what is true or false, but about what is accepted, what is emphasized, and what remains at the edges of understanding. The possibility exists, supported in part by evidence, yet not fully integrated into the larger narrative. It creates a sense that the answer may not be hidden, but waiting in a space that has not been fully explored. And for those who follow the evidence closely, that space becomes difficult to ignore. The work of these scientists does not provide a final conclusion. It does not resolve the question of oil's origin. Instead, it expands it, showing that the story may be more layered than it first appears, shaped by both what is known and what is still being considered. And as these ideas continue to develop, the focus begins to shift once again, because a possibility, no matter how compelling, must be tested beyond theory. It must be examined under conditions that move closer to reality, where observation and experiment begin to meet, and where the question becomes not just whether something could happen, but whether it does. The shift from idea to experiment does not happen suddenly. It begins with a question that feels simple, almost quiet in its form. If hydrocarbons could form deep within the Earth without the presence of life, could that process be recreated, even in a limited way, under controlled conditions? To answer this, scientists turned away from the field and into the laboratory, where the environment could be shaped with precision. The goal was not to replicate the Earth in its entirety, but to isolate key elements of its deeper conditions. Pressure, temperature, and the presence of basic materials became the focus. The experiments were carefully designed. Simple inorganic compounds, elements that exist naturally within the Earth, were placed under extreme pressure. Heat was applied, gradually increasing, until the environment within the chamber began to resemble, in a small and simplified way, what might be found far beneath the surface. Nothing about the setup was dramatic. There were no sudden transformations, no visible signs that something extraordinary was about to occur. The process unfolded slowly, guided by controlled adjustments, observed with patience. And then, over time, something began to emerge. The materials did not remain in their original form. Under the combined influence of heat and pressure, their structure changed. New compounds appeared, ones that carried a familiar pattern. Hydrocarbons, the same basic structures found in oil, formed within the system. The result was quiet, but it carried weight. It did not rely on the presence of organic material. There were no remains of life involved, no biological processes guiding the transformation. Instead, it was driven entirely by physical and chemical conditions, the same kinds of forces that exist deep within the Earth. The implication was not immediate, but it was clear enough to consider. If hydrocarbons could form in this way within a controlled environment, then it became possible that similar processes might occur naturally, on a much larger scale, within the Earth itself. The laboratory did not prove that this was happening, but it removed a limitation. It showed that life was not the only pathway through which these substances could form. This did not erase the role of biology. The transformation of organic material into oil remained a well-supported process, one that explained many observations, but it was no longer the only possibility. Instead, the perspective widened. Oil could be seen not as the result of a single origin, but as something that might form through multiple pathways, each influenced by different conditions, each contributing to what is eventually found beneath the surface. The experiments did not answer every question. They were limited in scale, simplified, compared to the vast complexity of the Earth. But they did something equally important. They showed that the boundary between what was considered possible and impossible was not as fixed as it once seemed. This realization did not arrive with certainty. It came gradually, as the results were examined, repeated, and compared with observations from the field. It required careful interpretation, a willingness to consider that the familiar explanation might not be complete. And for those who followed this line of inquiry, the implications extended beyond the laboratory. Because if such processes could occur under controlled conditions, then the Earth, with its immense scale and continuous activity, might be capable of far more. The pressure found deep within its interior, the heat that moves through its layers, the constant interaction of elements over vast periods of time, all suggest an environment where these transformations could take place naturally. The idea does not stand alone. It connects with the anomalies observed in deep wells, with the patterns that do not fully align with the biological model, with the quiet questions that have been building throughout the story. Together, they form a broader picture, one that is still incomplete, but increasingly difficult to ignore. And as that picture begins to take shape, the focus shifts once again, moving beyond the laboratory and into the Earth itself, toward the deeper systems that sustain these conditions, where the processes are not controlled, not limited, but continuous, unfolding over timescales that extend far beyond anything that can be directly observed. The story does not remain on Earth. It begins to extend outward, slowly, almost quietly, as though following a path that has always been there but rarely noticed. The focus shifts beyond the surface, beyond the atmosphere, into a space that feels distant yet connected in ways that are not immediately clear. Far from the planet, in regions where life as we know it does not exist, something familiar begins to appear. In the vast clouds that drift between stars, molecules form and move through space, shaped by conditions that are both extreme and subtle. These clouds are cold, dark, and immense, yet within them, chemical interactions continue without pause. Carbon and hydrogen come together, forming structures that resemble the building blocks of substances found on Earth. These are hydrocarbons. They exist without oceans, without ecosystems, without any trace of biological activity. They form in environments where the concept of life does not apply, where the only guiding forces are energy, pressure, and the interaction of elements over time. The discovery of these molecules does not arrive with dramatic impact. It emerges gradually, through observation and analysis, through the careful study of light and the way it interacts with matter in space. Patterns appear, signatures that reveal the presence of complex compounds drifting silently through the cosmos. Comets, moving through the outer regions of planetary systems, carry similar materials. Their surfaces and interiors hold traces of carbon-based compounds, preserved in conditions that have remained largely unchanged since their formation. These objects, often seen as remnants of the early solar system, offer a glimpse into processes that occurred long before the Earth reached its current state. Even on distant planets and moons, hydrocarbons have been detected. Some exist in liquid form, under conditions that differ entirely from those on Earth. Others are present as gases or solids, shaped by environments that would not support life, yet still capable of producing and sustaining these compounds. The patterns repeat, not identically, but consistently enough to suggest that they are not isolated occurrences. This introduces a quiet but profound shift in perspective. Hydrocarbons are no longer seen as something that belongs exclusively to Earth, or as substances that must originate from life. They appear as part of a broader pattern, one that extends across space, shaped by processes that are not limited to a single planet. The implication is not immediate, but it begins to take form. If hydrocarbons can exist in space, if they can form in environments that have never supported life, then their origin cannot be tied solely to biological processes. They must also be connected to chemical interactions that occur under a wide range of conditions, influenced by forces that operate on a cosmic scale. This does not remove the role of life on Earth. It does not suggest that all hydrocarbons found here share the same origin as those in space. But it expands the context, placing Earth within a larger system where similar substances can arise through different pathways. The familiar becomes part of something wider. Oil, once understood primarily as a product of ancient life, begins to feel connected to processes that extend far beyond the planet. It becomes one expression of a pattern that exists throughout the universe, shaped by the same fundamental elements and forces. The realization is subtle, but it carries weight. It suggests that what is found beneath the Earth's surface may not be entirely unique, that the processes involved in its formation may be part of a system that operates on scales much larger than previously considered. And once that idea begins to settle, the story turns back. Because if hydrocarbons are not unique to Earth, if they can form without life in distant regions of space, then the processes within the planet itself must be reconsidered in that light. The focus returns, not to what was previously assumed, but to how the Earth fits within this broader pattern, where local explanations begin to connect with something far more expansive. The view widens further, and the Earth begins to feel less like a separate place and more like a continuation of something much older. The elements that shape the planet did not originate here. They were formed long before the Earth existed, in environments far more extreme than anything found within its boundaries. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, these are not just components of the Earth. They are products of earlier processes, created within stars, carried across space, and gathered together as new systems began to form. The planet itself is not an isolated beginning, but a moment within a much longer sequence. When the Earth first took shape, it did so from material that had already been through countless transformations. Dust and gas, moving through space, combined under the influence of gravity, gradually forming a body that would continue to evolve. Within that process, the same elements that existed in distant regions of the universe became part of the planet's structure. This connection is often acknowledged, but rarely felt. The Earth is usually seen as something self-contained, a system with its own history, its own processes, its own outcomes. But when viewed from a wider perspective, it becomes clear that those processes are not entirely independent. They are extensions of patterns that existed long before the planet formed. This changes how substances like oil are understood. If hydrocarbons exist in space, if they can form without life in distant environments, then their presence on Earth may not be limited to what has happened here. It may be part of a broader continuity, shaped by the same interactions that occur across the universe. The idea introduces a different kind of origin. Not a single moment when oil began, not a specific event tied to a particular set of conditions on Earth, but a chain of processes that extend back through time, linking the planet to something much larger. The formation of hydrocarbons becomes part of a sequence that did not start with life and may not end with it. This does not remove the role of Earth's history. The processes that occur within the planet, the influence of life, the movement of elements through its layers, all remain essential parts of the story. But they are no longer the only parts. They become chapters within a longer narrative. The Earth, in this sense, acts as a stage where broader patterns continue to unfold. The same elements, the same interactions, the same fundamental forces that operate in space are present here, shaped by local conditions but connected to a wider system. This connection is not always visible. It does not appear in a way that can be directly observed in daily life. But it exists within the structure of the planet, within the composition of the materials that make up its surface and interior. And within that structure, the possibility of multiple pathways for hydrocarbon formation begins to feel less unusual. If the same elements can combine in different ways across the universe, then it follows that they could do so within the Earth as well, influenced by conditions that vary from place to place, from depth to depth. The origin of oil becomes less about a single explanation and more about a network of processes that intersect over time. The thought is not meant to replace what is known, but to expand it. It suggests that the story of oil may not be confined to the boundaries of the Earth, but connected to processes that began long before the planet existed. That what is found beneath the surface today may carry traces of interactions that extend far beyond its immediate environment. This perspective brings a quiet sense of continuity. The past is no longer limited to the history of life on Earth. It stretches further back into a time when the elements themselves were forming, when the conditions that would later shape the planet were already in motion. And as this broader view begins to settle, the question changes once again. It is no longer just about where oil comes from, but about how its origin fits within this larger system. How processes that occur across space and time connect to what is observed beneath the surface, and what that connection reveals about the nature of the planet itself. From here, the narrative moves toward those implications, toward the way this expanded perspective reshapes understanding, not by replacing existing ideas, but by placing them within a wider context that continues to unfold. The story no longer moves in a straight line. What once appeared to have a clear beginning now unfolds into something wider, less defined, shaped by multiple paths that intersect rather than converge into a single point. The question that guided everything where oil comes from begins to change, not because it has been answered, but because it has become something deeper. The familiar explanation still remains. The idea that oil formed from ancient life, buried and transformed over time, continues to hold its place. It explains patterns that are well observed, connects biological processes to chemical outcomes, and provides a foundation that has guided understanding for generations. But it no longer stands alone. Alongside it, another layer has taken shape. The possibility that hydrocarbons can form deep within the Earth, driven by pressure, heat, and the interaction of elements, independent of life. This pathway does not replace the biological one, but it exists alongside it, offering a different perspective on how similar substances can emerge under different conditions. And beyond that, something even broader begins to appear. The presence of hydrocarbons in space, in environments where life has never existed, suggests that the formation of these compounds is not limited to a single setting. It extends across the universe, shaped by processes that operate wherever the necessary elements and conditions come together. These pathways do not compete with one another, they overlap. They form a network of possibilities, each contributing to the presence of hydrocarbons in different ways, under different circumstances. The Earth becomes a place where these processes intersect, where biological, geological, and cosmic influences may all play a role in shaping what is found beneath the surface. This shifts the nature of the question itself. It is no longer about identifying a single origin, a specific moment when oil began. It becomes an exploration of how it can form, how different processes can lead to similar outcomes, how multiple pathways can exist within the same system. The focus moves from origin to formation, from a fixed explanation to a dynamic set of interactions that continue over time. Oil is no longer seen as a product with one history, but as a substance that may carry traces of multiple histories, layered together in ways that are not always easy to separate. This does not create confusion. It creates depth. It allows for a more complete understanding, one that does not rely on a single answer, but accepts that complexity is part of the system being observed. It reflects the way the Earth operates, not through isolated processes, but through interactions that unfold across different scales and conditions. The realization arrives quietly. That the search for a single beginning may have been too narrow, that the story of oil is not confined to one pathway, but expands outward, connecting different processes into a larger whole. Each explanation becomes part of that whole, contributing to a broader understanding that continues to evolve. This perspective does not remove uncertainty, it embraces it. It recognizes that the presence of multiple pathways means that the story is still being explored, still being refined. It invites curiosity rather than closure, encouraging a way of thinking that remains open to new possibilities. And within that openness, the narrative finds a new direction. Because once the idea of a single origin is set aside, the focus naturally returns to the present, not to what has already happened, but to what is still happening. To how these processes continue to unfold, how they influence what is found today, and what that might mean for the future. The Earth remains at the center of that question. Not as an isolated system, but as part of something larger, where the formation of substances like oil reflects both local conditions and broader patterns. The story, once expanded outward, now begins to draw back, carrying with it a new perspective that reshapes how everything that follows will be understood. The story returns to where it began, but nothing feels the same. The Earth, once seen as a backdrop to everything else, now takes on a different presence. It is no longer just the setting in which events unfold. It becomes the source, the system, the quiet force behind processes that continue without interruption. Everything that has been explored begins to settle into place. The role of ancient life, the slow transformation of organic matter, the immense forces within the planet, the movement of elements through unseen pathways, the presence of hydrocarbons beyond Earth, all of these ideas no longer stand apart. They begin to connect, forming a larger picture that is less about choosing one explanation and more about understanding how they exist together. The Earth is not limited to a single process. It operates through layers of interaction, where biological, geological, and chemical systems overlap. Each contributes in its own way, shaped by conditions that vary across time and space. What is formed at one depth may be influenced by what occurs at another. What begins in one context may continue in another. Within this system, oil takes on a new meaning. It is no longer only a product of the past, something created under specific conditions long ago and preserved until it is discovered. It becomes part of an ongoing process, one that continues to unfold beneath the surface, shaped by forces that have not stopped acting. The idea does not arrive as a definitive claim. It remains a possibility, supported by patterns, by observations, by the growing understanding that the Earth is far more active than it once appeared. The same conditions that may have contributed to the formation of oil in the past still exist in different forms today. Heat continues to rise. Pressure continues to shape the behavior of materials deep within the planet. Elements continue to interact, forming structures that reflect both their origins and their environment. These processes do not belong to a single moment in history. They are continuous. The realization is subtle, but it carries weight. The story of oil is not something that simply happened and then ended. It is something that may still be happening, unfolding slowly, quietly, beyond direct observation. What is found at the surface may represent only a small part of a larger system that extends far below. This perspective changes the sense of time. Instead of looking only backward, toward a distant origin, the focus begins to include the present. The processes that shape the Earth are not confined to the past. They continue, influencing what exists now and what may emerge in the future. The Earth becomes less of a record and more of an active system. It does not just hold the results of what has already occurred. It continues to create, to transform, to shape outcomes that are not yet fully understood. Oil, in this sense, becomes one example among many, a visible trace of processes that extend beyond immediate perception. This does not replace what has been learned. It expands it. It allows for the possibility that multiple processes contribute to the same outcome, that the Earth's behavior cannot be fully captured by a single explanation. It invites a broader view, one that sees connections rather than boundaries. The tone of the story shifts again, not toward conclusion, but toward continuity. There is no final moment where everything becomes fixed and complete. There is only an ongoing process, one that continues to unfold regardless of how it is understood. The deeper the perspective moves, the more it becomes clear that the system does not stop. It continues beneath every surface, within every layer, shaping outcomes that are both familiar and unknown. And as this understanding begins to settle, the focus turns once more. Because if the Earth is still creating, still evolving, still shaping substances like oil, then the way it is understood must also continue to evolve. The question is no longer just about what the Earth does, but about how that understanding influences the way it is seen, interpreted, and connected to everything that depends on it. The story turns, gently, toward those who have been observing it all along. Humanity does not stand outside the system it studies. It moves within it, shaped by the same forces, dependent on the same processes, connected in ways that are often easy to overlook. The Earth is not separate from human experience. It is the foundation of it. Oil, in this context, becomes more than a resource. It becomes a point of connection. It links the deep processes of the planet to the surface world, where human activity unfolds. It carries within it traces of time, pressure, transformation elements that exist far beyond immediate perception, yet become part of everyday life through use and application. Vehicles move, materials are formed, systems operate, all supported by something that originated far below, shaped by conditions that existed long before human awareness. And yet, once it reaches the surface, it becomes part of human decision. It is extracted, refined, distributed, used. Each step reflects choices, shaped by understanding, influenced by need, guided by perception. The substance itself does not change its nature, but its role becomes intertwined with human activity. This creates a different perspective. Humanity is not simply taking from the earth, it is interacting with it, participating in a system that continues to operate regardless of observation. The processes that form, move, and transform substances like oil do not begin or end with human involvement, but human actions become part of how those substances are brought into the visible world. The relationship is not one-directional. It is reciprocal. The earth provides, but it also responds, not in a conscious sense, but through the natural consequences of interaction. Extraction alters pressure within reservoirs. Movement of materials shifts conditions in subtle ways. The system adjusts, continues, adapts over time. Within this interaction, understanding plays a central role. The way oil is perceived influences how it is used. If it is seen as finite, decisions are shaped by limitation. If it is viewed as part of a more complex system, those decisions may begin to shift, guided by a broader awareness of how it fits within the larger structure of the earth. This does not lead to a single conclusion. It opens a space for reflection. What does it mean to use something that is still part of an ongoing process? How does perception influence action? How does understanding shape the relationship between humanity and the systems it depends on? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They remain present, inviting consideration rather than resolution, because the story of oil is not separate from the story of those who use it. It becomes part of human history, part of daily life, part of the systems that define how societies function. It connects the deep past with the present, the unseen processes of the earth with the visible patterns of human activity. And within that connection, something shifts. The idea of separation begins to fade. Humanity is not outside the system, observing it from a distance. It exists within it, influenced by it, contributing to it in ways that are both direct and indirect. The actions taken, the choices made, the interpretations formed, all become part of the ongoing story. This realization is not overwhelming. It is quiet. It suggests that the relationship between humanity and the earth is not fixed, not defined by a single perspective, but shaped by understanding that continues to evolve. It allows for the possibility that this relationship can change, not through sudden transformation, but through gradual shifts in awareness. Oil, then, becomes more than a resource to be used. It becomes a connection to something larger, a reminder of the processes that continue beneath the surface and of the role humanity plays within that system. And as this perspective begins to settle, the story moves toward its final reflection. Not to close what has been opened, but to gather it together, to consider what it means to understand something that remains in motion, and to leave space for what continues beyond the edge of what is known. The story does not arrive at an ending. It softens instead, becoming quieter, less defined, as though it is moving beyond the need to explain itself. What remains is not a conclusion, but a sense of presence, something that continues even as attention begins to drift away. The earth carries on. It turns without pause, holding within it the same forces that have shaped every moment of its existence. Beneath the surface, movement continues, slow and constant. Heat rises, pressure shifts, elements interact in ways that do not require observation to persist. Nothing announces these processes. There is no signal that marks their importance, no moment that separates one phase from another. They unfold quietly, repeating patterns that have never truly stopped, even when they became too subtle to notice. Oil remains part of this continuity. It exists beneath the surface, within layers shaped by time, influenced by conditions that extend far beyond immediate awareness. Whether formed through ancient biological transformation, deep geological processes, or pathways not yet fully understood, it continues to be part of a system that does not reach a final state. The story, then, does not end. It fades into the background, becoming part of the same quiet movement that defines the Earth itself. The questions that guided it remain, not as problems to be solved, but as openings that continue to invite exploration. Understanding does not arrive as a fixed point. It moves. It expands, shifts, adjusts as new perspectives emerge. What is known today becomes part of a larger framework tomorrow, shaped by discoveries that have yet to be made. The process does not conclude, because the system it seeks to describe does not stop. There is something steady in this realization, a sense that the search does not require completion in order to have meaning, that the value lies not only in the answers that are found, but in the continuation of the questions themselves. The silence that settles here is not empty. It is filled with motion that no longer calls attention to itself. The same exchanges between elements continue, the same interactions unfold, the same processes shape outcomes in ways that remain largely unseen. The Earth does not pause for recognition. It does not wait to be understood. It continues, just as it always has, carrying within it systems that extend across time, linking the past to the present, and the present to what has not yet emerged. And within that continuity, oil becomes something more than a subject of study. It becomes a trace, a reminder of processes that operate beneath everything, of connections that are not always visible, of a story that extends beyond what can be fully captured in words. The final thought does not arrive with certainty. It arrives with openness. That understanding is not a destination that can be reached and completed. It is a movement, a process that continues as long as there are questions to ask, as long as there are patterns to observe, as long as there is curiosity to follow. The story remains unfinished, because it was never meant to be finished. It exists within a system that continues to evolve, to create, to transform without end. Each moment becomes part of that process, each discovery a step within a path that does not have a final boundary. And so the narrative does not close. It quiets. It settles into the same stillness from which it began, leaving behind not an answer but a sense of continuity. The Earth continues its work, unseen and uninterrupted, shaping a story that moves forward without needing to be fully understood, carrying within it the same quiet motion that has always been there, waiting to be noticed, and then, just as quietly, continuing on.